Hello and welcome back to Imagination Mansion. On episode 3 of Building a Story, I am talking about settings. I think writing a setting depends on the kind of story that you're writing. So if you're writing something more mundane and urban, or just, everyday life like a romance or a drama or something like that, you'll probably just want to make sure that you know the area, like the real life area that you're basing the place on, or that you're literally putting the story in. But obviously if you are, writing a historical novel, obviously you'll want to know not only where that place is, but also what that place was like at the time you're setting it. And then another layer up from that, if you're writing a alternate universe, like a fantasy or a sci-fi or something else, I suppose, this is where it gets a bit more complicated, or at least a bit more in-depth, because obviously you don't have, especially if you're writing about somewhere where you live, which I think a few writers do, if you know the local area, then you know where everything is and you know what everything looks like. So if you're writing a fantasy or a sci-fi, or you're writing about a completely different area, you obviously kind of have to start from scratch, either from research, if you're researching a real place, or imagination. And this also comes in with a link of, how does architecture work and all that kind of stuff. World building for fantasy and sci-fi is kind of where I feel the most comfortable, because as I've said in my books that influence me and my films that influence me, I enjoy escapism in my work. And so the places that I write about kind of reflect that, because I don't want anything to do with the real life. I just want somewhere that doesn't exist with people that don't exist on an adventure that couldn't happen. So I tend to go into the more fantasy sci-fi world building-esque idea. Now I have two different ways of world building. One is a lot simpler than the other. So the simplest version is basically I have a general idea of what is where, with more in-depth ideas of places that are actually visited or mentioned or just passed through during the story. So I know where A is, how to get to B, and what is in between. And unless something else is mentioned, or I just know that something else is important, I tend to just have a general map in my head. But there's also option 2, which is absolutely nosedive into every aspect of world building, because the story that I'm editing at the moment is very much idea 1, which is, I know where everything is, I know how to get from A to B, and I know where the characters are going. So the reader knows where the character is going. But because it's a certain type of landscape, you don't have to go into too much detail, because the reader, I like the reader to imagine the kind of place that it is, because it doesn't need to be too specific. So but the story that I'm kind of in the planning process of at the moment, because I'm sure I'm not alone in this, I need more than one project going at a time, otherwise I can't focus, or I get bored, or basically just distracted. But if I've got more than one project at the same time, I find it easier to bounce between the two, because I can almost keep my productivity levels up. I don't know. Anyway, so the story that I'm planning at the moment is a more in-depth world building concept. So I am diving into world structure, physical and political. I am diving into, because it's a sci-fi-esque one, I'm diving into, scientific laws and sort of building types and all these different, you know, techie things, and sort of like how society works, like different species, how they interact and all this kind of stuff. So I get very into it because I am a nerd of many areas. So, you know, I like science, so I draw on that. I like history, so I draw on that. I like architecture, so I draw on that. I have like a passing interest in fashion, but because obviously, depending on the story I'm writing, if it's a simpler story, I tend to use like version 1 of story building, where it's just, I know where everything is and the reader knows everything that needs to be known. And then the rest of it, if it's like, if they're like, have a bit more of a wider imagination, they can kind of fill in the blanks because there's enough information to do that. So I'd say for that, like option sort of like, make sure that you have at least the gist of where you are. I'd say that important locations that you probably should know and should map out, so you at least know what they look like and how they relate to each other, are wherever the main characters or anyone important in the cast comes from, so where they live. And this is both like the actual like house slash apartment slash borough, depending on what story you're writing, and also like the local area. So, you know, do they live in a big town, a little village, a forest, like a beachside cave? You know, you need to know the location of where your characters are coming from. Any locations interacted with in the plot. So if they have a fight in a car park, you have to know where the car park is, what the car park looks like. You know, if they do a shady deal in a back alley, which back alley, where is it, how dark is it, wherever is passed through while going from the cave to the back alley. So are they passing through a cityscape, are they passing through a village, are they passing through like a dusty road through the countryside, just so that your reader can always have their bearings on where they are at what time. Anywhere of significance that is even just mentioned in passing, if you've said it exists or just know that it exists, you need to know what it's like and where it is. So for this, I say you can probably just use like a generic map, which just shows what's north, south, east, west, and kind of have a little, you know, little icons that just say, you know, maybe how dense the population is, or, you know, just what's around in the area. Just so you know how characters would get to A to B and what they would pass through to get there. This I think is fine for quite a few things, like, because quite a few stories use, you know, like a streamlined plot where you are interacting with one, maybe two characters who are on similar journeys. So they don't interact, so you don't interact with the entirety of the world. But with a lot more open world fantasy, or just with bigger casts, with, you know, a longer journey, with separate journeys taking place in completely different areas, especially if parts of the story is based on lore, so you have like two warring parties and all that kind of stuff, and you need to go into the politics of that. You will obviously need to know a lot more of the setting, and you'll have to go into a lot more detail, especially if, you know, you've got more than one species, and even more so if you know you're doing a science fiction that involves, you know, like planet hopping. So you'll need to know whatever original planet looks like, and then whatever other planets look like, as well as any, you know, spaceships and, you know, space stations that are mentioned as well. As a general rule, I would say decide on the type of setting that you want. such as rural fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk science fiction, urban science fiction, super high-tech world, like basically just like ours but just a bit different. And look at other examples of these worlds. So, you know, look at these drawings that people have done of like steampunk worlds. Look at, you know, concept art. Watch Lord of the Rings if you're into, you know, the more rural fantasy. Obviously research real places if that's what you're basing it on. So, you know, if you want it to be a big city, you know, research places like London, Paris, Tokyo, so you can kind of get an idea of what kind of big city you want it to be like. Like, do you want it to be like streamlined, you know, orderly, very built up, or do you want it to be kind of like this clearly expanded over time and there's just higgledy-piggledy like blocks of flats everywhere? So definitely look into the kind of world that you want and kind of get, so you've got somewhere to start, so you've got like an image in your head that you can then write about to plant that image in your reader's head. I have a bit more of a challenge with this because for me the images tend to come into my head, so then I almost have to hunt down something that looks similar so that I can figure out like how they've written about it, so how, since mine is similar, how I could write about mine. It gets complicated. Welcome to having a very visual imagination and the troubles that that can cause when trying to put it into words. That was me talking about settings. Obviously this was kind of very vague because my problem is I either go, like I said before, I either go enough detail to make the story work or I go ham. But let me know, like, what's your favourite type of world building? Like, do you like the epic fantasy where you have a pull-out map and you've got these epic descriptions of, you know, like rolling hills or like intense metropolitan areas? Or do you not mind and you prefer to focus on the characters, and as long as you know where you are, you're not fussed? So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, and I'll be making a video every week, so do subscribe. Comment, like I said, what's your favorite type of setting? How do you prefer to write settings? And yeah.